in terms of managing the class. A very good morning to you all, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's session. And as you are aware, today's session is really an extension of what we covered last week, only that we are unable to complete. Right. I hope you will be able to benefit from today's lecture. Right. So I'll begin by sharing my slides. And these are the slides that I actually used last week, and only that we are unable to complete, right, ladies and gentlemen. So last week we were looking at our fourth module, generating high impact doctoral research problems, but centering on gap spotting versus problematization. Just to remind you a few things that we covered last week, ladies and gentlemen, without going into the learning objectives and so forth. I told you that this is an important topic because not every gap that we land on in various reviews is worth our effort, meaning that it may not be worth a significant contribution, and therefore you can actually ignore it, right? And of course, I also did indicate that many times when you review journal articles, you'll find statements that are being used. For example, statements like few studies have examined, or probably statements like limited research exists on maybe this particular aspect of financial inclusion, or probably there is a lack of research that investigates this aspect, right? Or in other settings, someone might say, well, the relationship between maybe financial literacy or probably regulatory regimes and financial literacy has not been tested, that kind of thing. So I did also indicate that while those statements may identify areas that have received limited scholarly attention, right? Many contemporary scholars now argue that gap identification alone is often insufficient in producing very strong theoretical contributions, meaning that whereas that is very fine and you can do it, but it is insufficient. And therefore, if we look at your research, right, and just read your introduction or a statement of the problem, right, and find a statement like that little attention has been paid to A, B, and C, and you produce evidence to support your statement, that does not necessarily result into a strong doctoral thesis, right? And that is the argument of contemporary scholars these days, right? So just saying that something has not been studied, that does not automatically justify why it should be studied, right? So, and I think one of the things that we did interrogate at length is the fact that a lack of research in one area may actually simply reflect a lack of importance rather than an opportunity for significant contribution. So as you make those statements, please be mindful of the fact that you need to really justify why scholars should listen to you, why scholars should read your work in that particular area. Otherwise, it may not be necessary, right? Because what you're saying maybe does not result into significant contribution, right? So that's why the concern, right, has led to a growing body of scholarship, which actually advocates for problematization as a more powerful approach to generating research questions and scholarly contributions. And if you recall, I did give you the influential scholars, right, in that area, like Matt Alverson in organizational studies, Jorgen Sandberg, right, plus a number of others. They have actually shaped, their work have fundamentally reshaped our thinking about how research problems should be formulated. And as I said later on, as we conclude this session, we might be able to try and venture into stating or coming up with what I call a statement of the problem. Now, given the amount of work that I will be covering today, I cannot see that coming today. However, I'll have another session tomorrow where I will spend about 1 hour in the evening or 1.5 hours. I'll begin by doing exactly that, giving you examples of how research or how statements of the problem can be crafted. And I think we shall use 1 or 2 examples before we go into another important area. Now, of course, we went into the historical development of gap spotting, right? We try to understand gap spotting, right? And I do not intend to go into that because we did that. The historical development of gap spotting, the types, right, of gaps. If you recall, we went through empirical, contextual, population, methodological, temporal, right, and theoretical. Now, those were examples of, and as I did indicate, some books really state as many gaps as maybe around 17 or 20. Some books actually will list around 12, while others list around 6, right? But I just picked a few purposes of advancing our argument so that you understand the types of gaps that exist, right? Like empirical gaps, insufficient evidence, contextual gaps, research absent in specific settings, population gaps, some groups remain understudied, methodological, where you have over-reliance on one method, temporal gaps, knowledge becomes a little bit outdated, right? Especially, I think that's where our friend Wang Koko asked a question about artificial intelligence and his theory of connectivity, right? And I think that was the last question that was posed, or our last observation, and that's a discussion that we had. Right, but there are also theoretical gaps, theory not applied or tested sufficiently, right, in specific context, ladies and gentlemen. Again, we went through strength of gap spotting in terms of identifying and explore the areas, supporting knowledge accumulation, as you can see, and helping early researchers really to have a starting point and undertake research in that particular area, and also encouraging literature engagement, because researchers must review existing knowledge carefully so that they are able to add, right, knowledge to the existing body of knowledge. And I think that will, in our today's lecture, that will be more or less the concluding aspect when we go to problematization. And I want us to understand problematization very, very well, ladies and gentlemen. But we also looked at weaknesses or what we call limitations of gap spotting in terms of really producing what we call incremental contributions, right? And also encouraging mechanical research and things like that. Of course, there are so many other aspects like preserving existing assumptions, right? If you only focus your study, or you base your study on your gaps, right? That means you are more or less preserving existing assumptions, and therefore you may not have a significant contribution to knowledge, right? And of course, limiting theoretical innovations because you are more or less bent, right, to accepting the kinds of things that we know. So from there, if you recall, I took you through philosophical foundations, right? And I hope you still remember the philosophical basis for all this. So, ladies and gentlemen, having said that, I now want to take you to today's topic. And today we are going to look at problematization, right? And the problematization is an important area that we must pay attention to as scholars, because Alverson and Alvinson and Sandberg, I mean, they do actually more or less point us into that direction, right? So we need to understand the problematization very, very well, ladies and gentlemen, right? Now, what do we understand by problematization, right? Now, problematization, ladies and gentlemen, refers to the process of critically examining and challenging assumptions underlying existing concepts, existing theories, existing paradigms, existing methods, and of course, accepted ways of undertaking a phenomenon. And if you read the works of Alverson and Sandberg, that is the work they published in 2011, you will discover that major theoretical contributions emerge not from identifying what has not been studied, but from questioning what scholars usually take for granted, right? Like now, I think in your case, whatever you read in literature, you tend to even cram, right, and reproduce because you think that what has been documented is actually correct, right? You take it as the gospel truth, the way we read the Bible and Quran, and somebody will come to the church like tomorrow, your pastors, your reverend fathers, and the rest will come and deliver, right? And they tell you the gospel according to Matthew, right? And or they say the gospel according to Mark, or the gospel according to, I mean, all those fellows that you know that exist in the Bible, and you have no room to question anything that the reverends will be saying tomorrow, and even your pastors, and you take those things for granted. Right. This is not what we do in research because we do not develop knowledge, right? If you do not question, I mean, you limit your understanding. You have more or less reached the ceiling. And therefore, whatever book that you read and you find those things that have been documented, do not simply take them as true, right? Most of the things that are obsolete, right, they have outlived their time. So don't simply take, I mean, that's why you are scholars, right? And that's why we are ushering you in this area of the PhD. You are going to become a doctor of, I mean, you are entering that field. So PhD, that is Doctor of Philosophy, right? So in other words, you join that group. So even when you have not studied too much philosophy, ladies and gentlemen, right, you are a philosopher. Naturally, you're a philosopher because you keep on interrogating issues around you, right? I mean, if you could ask, for example, people like Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, and the rest of them, who taught the first philosopher, for example, and why is he called a philosopher or the father of philosophy, right? Now, I mean, it's because people believed, right, around that time, and we still do so, that whoever thinks like that and questions most of the paradigms, most of the theories, most of the assumptions that are taken for granted, you actually join that bench of philosophers, ladies and gentlemen. So most theoretical contributions, according to Alverson and Sandberg, emerge, right, from questioning what scholars take for granted, ladies and gentlemen, but not simply identifying gaps. And you continue, you say, well, my PhD is based on this gap. The question is, so what? Right. What is your contribution to knowledge? I mean, even when you state your gap very, very well, whether empirical, right, or methodological or philosophical, whatever it is, even when you do a great job in terms of stating it, right, I will expect you to extend, right, that knowledge of yours to problematization. And you begin asking questions like, what assumptions are, for example, shaping existing knowledge in that particular area, right? So not only identifying a gap, but please identify, right, assumptions that shape that particular area, that particular knowledge domain, right? And why do scholars, for example, believe these particular assumptions? And to me, that is very important, right? Why? I mean, what are those assumptions that are taken for granted that are generally accepted by scholars, right? What if they are wrong, right? Like now, right now, there's a book we are working on in the area of economics, right? But challenging the core assumption, right, of economics, the central assumption of economics that rests in what we call scarcity, right? Because the central problem of economics is scarcity. Where did that kind of thinking come from, right? Is it because we have scarcity mindsets, right? And is it true that that is the issue that we are dealing with, right? And no amount of lectures will convince, right, us that the core or the central problem of economics is actually scarcity. Right. I know I have economists here, right? It's for you to begin thinking about it. We are writing, and one of these days, and we are inviting you to challenge our thinking too, right? But there are certain things that we take for granted, and we continue, right, believing those particular things as if they are gospel truth. You know, when you talk about Matthew, you say, but Matthew was with Jesus, and therefore he saw, right, what was happening, and he documented all this, and all scripture is inspired, right? And of course, the central reason why they will tell you so is that you do not extend your mind in terms of questioning those particular things. So here we question, right, this because we know some scholars believe certain assumptions and a number of assumptions. So why do scholars believe? We go into that questioning, and that is philosophy, incidentally. Why do scholars believe these assumptions? What if these assumptions are wrong? In other words, what would now be what we call alternative explanations? Are there alternative explanations that might exist, right, instead of taking these things for granted? And how would our understanding, for example, change if we viewed the phenomenon differently? You know, we put on different lenses, a number of lenses. When you say Reverend Father appears in church and preaching, and your pastor and so forth, it's because he's putting on a certain lens, right? Now you need to understand the lens that your Reverend Father is putting on before you take everything given to you wholesale, right? And sometimes they may also misunderstand some of these things. So we now have what we call philosophical foundations, right, of problematization. Luckily enough, I've already taken you through these things. I've given you a book by Karl Popper on conjunctures and refutations. We also had lectures in that area. I also introduced you to Kuhn, not Kahn, Kuhn, right? Thomas Kuhn, right? And I think we did also cover his philosophical orientation, right? Then you have Michael Foucault, right? Then you have critical theory and pragmatism, ladies and gentlemen, right? Now, of course, let me just give you some background information about this. Again, very, very brief before we move on, right? As I've said before, the concept of problematization has roots in several intellectual traditions. We call them intellectual traditions, right? And one of the intellectual tradition is Karl Popper's, right? And if you recall, Karl Popper simply states that scientific progress occurs through criticism and refutation. And that's why his book actually calls it Conjectures and Refutations. Right. And incidentally, if you have not studied these books, right, and somehow you get a PhD, you know that there's something wrong, something fundamentally wrong. You need to read these books, right? And that's why I sent them to you. And if there are other books you need, I'll send them over to you. I know some students requested for books on some of the theories, especially those that are used in management, like the resource-based view, stakeholder theory, agency theory, institutional theory, and the rest of them. I'll be posting them on the platform very soon. I have all of them. I have a collection of all those theories, right? Dynamic capabilities and the rest of them. Those are applied across disciplines. There are also some other psychological theories and technology theories. I'll certainly send them over, right, to you very soon, right? But I wanted to first deal with this issue of problematization, gap spotting and problematization, and also show you the mistakes that students make when they are problematizing, when they are constructing their PhD work. So they do not know that this is the core and heart, right? And that's why you need to know that actually philosophy of science, philosophy of methods is a core, it's the heart of your research. So unless you understand it, you might have a practical problem, you might have a gap, you might have all of those things. You might be having a tool. I mean, all the tools, just like someone who is going to make a chair. He has the nails, he has a hammer, he has the furniture, etc., but cannot piece up everything together to come up with a very nice and beautiful chair, right? And that exists. You remember last time when we were discussing conceptualization, operationalization, and measurement when we were in the Makerere University Library during our lectures on advanced research methods. I hope you still remember. I gave you different types. I showed you different types of chairs, right? And then I asked you which one is a chair, and all of them were chairs. I showed you different types of tables. Say which one is a table, which one is not a table. All of them were tables, right? Depending on the conceptualization and operationalization, right? And I think that was very, very okay. I think we ended up with the issue of religiosity as well, right? How we conceptualize, how we operationalize and measure religiosity. And that was very, very important. So if you have constructs that you're going to study in your research and you have identified them very well, then you must know how to interrogate and how to deal with those particular things. So when we talk about gap spotting and problematization, you might have the tools. You have identified the gap. You have identified, you have also done, you've identified a problem, right, in literature. But if you are unable to move from gap spotting to problematization and then from there piece it up with a practical issue that exists, you will not be able to craft a very good statement of the problem. It will be very hard even for you to write an introduction because you do not know what the introduction is all about. You keep on cramming what is contained in the introduction chapter. I know that some colleges and some universities have been given a structure of the introduction, right? They are told, within the introduction, right, a chapter, right, you have the background, right? First of all, you have an opening sentence, right, which must have A, B, C, and D. Then from there, you've got the background of the study. Then the background of the study must have, for example, the historical background, right? Then from the historical background, you must have theoretical background. Then from theoretical background, you must have conceptual background. From conceptual background, you must have contextual background. And then from there, you move down and develop a statement of the problem. So that will only remain as knowledge that has been crammed over time. And when you are writing, your writing will be mechanical, right? Because even the historical background, you don't know what you're talking about. You will start talking about the history of certain things that not even matching, that not relate to your topic at all, right? When it comes to theoretical background, you bring in all the theories that you've heard of, or the one that were taught by your professor, right? But none of them speaks to your topic or speaks to your problem, right? So that kind of integration, right? Of course, depending on how you're going to write, of course, that is a skill again, and that is an art that you have to pick. And you can always do a good job if you understand, right, these issues very well, so that you're able to craft, right, your introduction and statement of the problem. And once you do not have a very good statement of the problem, ladies and gentlemen, you have no purpose of the study, right? You have a confused one. Objectives of the study, whether general objective or specific objectives, right? Hypothesis, research questions, right? Or propositions, right? Whether you're going to mix them or not, again, that would be another story altogether that you have to think about. But the whole question goes back to philosophical foundations, where you start with Popper, who believes that scientific progress occurs through criticism and refutations. So you may actually come from there, or you might be coming from Thomas Kuhn's school of thought, where scientific revolutions emerge when anomalies challenge dominant paradigms. So meaning that you have identified a paradigm where you belong, and that could be positivistic or logical positivism, as we saw, or interpretivism, as you saw, or constructivism, plus a number of other variants that exist in that area. So in other words, you are able to know where you are coming from, right? And if you know where you are coming from, then it will be quite easy for you to problematize your literature, or problematize or come up with the problematization of whatever information or gaps that you have identified in the literature. I'll be doing that in this lecture, ladies and gentlemen. Now, of course, the other fellow is Michel or Michael Foucault. And you know what he says, right? Michel simply says that knowledge systems are historically constructed and linked to power. So meaning that if you're going to follow that intellectual philosophical tradition or foundation, then the power element must be present, meaning that in your study, you will not forget the element of power, right? There are always power dynamics in everything that we do, right? And I mean, every construct, by the way, every issue you're going to identify. If, for example, you're talking about enforcement, right, of rules and regulations, or enforcement of laws, there are power dynamics within the enforcement. If you're going to talk about financial inclusion, there are also power dynamics, right? If you're going to talk about performance, whether financial performance or market performance, wherever it is, there are also power dynamics in there. So the moment we see use bring in this element, then we know that you are coming from Foucault's intellectual domain or tradition, ladies and gentlemen, right? Now, of course, the other will be critical theory, and I'm sure you are very familiar with the critical theory, right? Where there's a general belief that dominant assumptions often reflect what we call underlying power structures. So every assumption, every dominant assumption that you find in literature or in any knowledge area or domain will always reflect underlying power structures, meaning that you need to unearth these power structures. So again, that is very important, and we are bringing it to your attention so that you know how to deal with the issue. Now, pragmatism on the other side, as we saw last time, right, believes in the fact that knowledge should be continually questioned and revised, right? So, in other words, you do not believe in an area where individuals will tell you that this is it, right? And we have developed knowledge in this area, which started maybe around 18th century or 17th century or 14th century, and this is all that we know. Just like in some of the religious circles, right, where they have developed these things, and you cannot question. So, according to pragmatism, we continually question, right, knowledge, right, that has been developed in that particular area, and we continue to revise. And that's why when you are using this in your work, right, because you are interested in what works, for example, you keep on questioning, right, and then coming up with the possibly better ways of dealing with things, right? So again, as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, Alverson and Sandberg, how I wish, I think I'll send you this book, right? But you need to read it so that you understand. And tomorrow you'll be helping your colleagues, right? If you read these particular, these books, right? So Alverson integrates these traditions that I've been talking about, the Popper, Kuhn, Foucault, critical theory, and pragmatism, right? Integrates all these traditions into a particular framework for generating research questions. And therefore, that is very important. In fact, the other thing I should probably mention at this time, many of you may have taken it for granted, but it's something that you need to know, right? It's an issue of a research problem, right? During your Viva, I know they will be asking you, right, what is your research problem? Right, what is your fundamental research question? And students get confused at this level. They forget that the core research, right, upon which your study is actually built, that is your research problem, right? Your research problem is actually the research question that you are trying to interrogate, right? So it is very, very important for you to know that, because the research question is what will indicate what you intend to do. So I think now we can go into the core logic, what I call the core logic of problematization, right? What is that core logic, right? If I could just remind you, when we were dealing with the gap spotting last time, which again I talked about briefly this morning, the traditional gap spotting, right, will be bringing out what has not been studied, right? This has not been studied in this area. There are few studies in this area, that kind of thing. And those are the statements that we started with, right? Maybe a few studies have interrogated the relations between A and B and so forth. But when we come to problematization, right? Problematization, we are looking at the assumptions that are preventing us from understanding the phenomenon differently, right? In other words, there is a phenomenon that exists, right? Various scholars have attempted to contribute towards it, but there's something that is preventing us from understanding the phenomenon differently, because you can have an alternative explanation, right? And you have a number of lenses that you could use, right? If you recall, there's a famous example I usually give you. If you have an accident near your university gate, right? Maybe as you are moving from Wandegeya, you are climbing Makerere Hill, right? So you are at the gate. Now all of a sudden, an overspeeding car knocks a student that is crossing the road, right? Or attempting to cross the road, right? You bring various people to explain what is happening, You bring a policeman, right? A policeman from traffic will tell you how actually the vehicle was a BMC, right? Bad mechanical condition, and therefore the fellow could not stop, right? When he saw this fellow, despite the presence of the zebra crossing, right? But the fellow forgets that even the one who was driving may not have seen the zebra crossing, or maybe his mindset was somewhere else. But the issue is not actually a BMC concept that the car is in bad mechanical condition. Right. Now you bring a psychologist. A psychologist will tell you how that student has had a very bad relationship with a boyfriend or girlfriend or family issue that had occurred 2 weeks before crossing that road. And therefore, the fellow was deeply taken up in thoughts and so forth, and was almost at the verge of running mad. And that is how he got knocked by the. You bring another fellow from a town council, right? The fellow who is in charge of city planning, right? The fellow will have another explanation. He says, but you know, the planning wasn't very good, right? The zebra crossing wasn't in the right place, right? They should have had this and this and the other, right? We should have had automatic this and the other, that kind of thing, right? So when we go into problematization, ladies and gentlemen, right, we get swamped up into those issues. What assumptions are preventing us from understanding the phenomenon differently? And of course, as you can see, this distinction that I'm bringing to the fore is profound, right? Because the first approach of gap spotting extends knowledge, but the second approach of problematization transforms knowledge, right? So it's not, we are not interested in just extending that, you know, a few studies were carried out in Europe, right, or probably among these disadvantaged, right, areas, but or populations, right, but let's do more of this and the other. No, right. So we move from extending knowledge to transformation of knowledge because we want to understand what is happening in that area. Let me just give you an example, ladies and gentlemen, so that we understand exactly the point that we are talking about. Right. For some of you who are from the business area and entrepreneurship, I'm going to use entrepreneurship, an example from entrepreneurship. Then from there, I'll go to the fellows in finance and also give you an example and a few others, right? And for some of you who are coming from natural sciences, public health, right? Or you're coming from chemistry, or probably you are coming from evolutionary biology, right? Perspective. Then you can also extend knowledge into that area. Now, if we go into entrepreneurship, ladies and gentlemen, and I know this is something that all of us are aware of, whether we are from biology or chemistry or medicine, we know that entrepreneurial success, right, according to the traditional assumptions that have been laid before us, right, by scholars, previous scholars, they talk about entrepreneurial success, right? So they have told us that entrepreneurial success results primarily from individual agency, right? So they'll be talking about individual agency, right? They'll be talking about risk taking. They'll be talking about motivation. They'll be talking about innovation, right? And we know this. In fact, if you take away these issues of risk taking, motivation, agency, right, innovation, plus a few others, I can assure you the discipline of entrepreneurship will vanish from the face of this earth, right? Because those are the taken for granted traditional assumptions, right? The assumptions. But if you want to extend your study into, if you want to use the gap spotting, right, the gap spotting, since that's where we started from, you can, for example, say few studies examine, right, entrepreneurship, right, among the youth. In other words, you want to see whether risk-taking or motivation or whatever it is are actually existing among the youth or refugee youth, right? Or among adult populations, right, or other populations, or even among students, either at ordinary level, secondary school level, or probably university level, right? So gap-based study will articulate that issue. Few studies examine this aspect of entrepreneurship in this setting. But problematization will say something that's a little bit different, right? Using the same kind of ideas. They will say that most entrepreneurial theories assume that entrepreneurial success largely depends on individual agency, right? And that's a dominant assumption that is taken for granted. So there's a general belief that if there is individual agency, then you are likely to achieve entrepreneurial success. So you start by stating what is known, right? But then you add, however, what if entrepreneurial outcomes among refugees are primarily determined by institutional constraints, or probably legal restrictions, or social exclusion, and limited access to resources rather than individual agency or individual characteristics? You see, you are bringing the element of the gap because, right, under the gap, you are saying few studies examine entrepreneurship among the refugee youth, right, and that's a gap. And someone who has limited knowledge of how to problematize literature will stop there. And most doctoral theses stop there, right? And therefore, you see, when you ask the student, why did you undertake this study? Few studies, it tells you, few studies examine entrepreneurship among refugee youth. Right? And that's why I'm studying entrepreneurship within the refugee youth. That's what they will say, right? Because that is where they stop, right, in understanding how we problematize, or how we come up with a statement of the problem, or how we come up with the problems. That is how they have been taught, right? And they take things for granted that once you make that statement and you produce evidence from literature, then that is okay, right? So if you bring now a very critical, what they call critical readers, right? And to read somebody's work, right? And interrogate the candidate on the PhD day when the fellow is making his presentation, the fellow will turn red and he will say, you know, the opponent, right, is very malicious. He was even told, right, to come and disorganize me so that I don't get my PhD. Right, that is a poor understanding of issues, right? So, but anyway, I don't blame you because your mentor may have taken you up to that level and left you there, and you have never crossed, right? It's like when the children of Israel wandered in the desert for, it's called wilderness. They wandered in the wilderness for 40 days, yet Canaan was just very near there. So they could not cross over to Canaan. But they kept on wandering and wandering and wandering, right, in the wilderness. And that's exactly what's happening, right? Some doctoral students are wandering in the wilderness instead of arriving in Canaan. So you need to cross over, ladies and gentlemen, to Canaan by problematizing. So the person who problematizes literature will, of course, first of all, begin by identifying a gap and problematize. And they will state that, yes, most entrepreneurial theories actually believe that success depends largely on individual agency. However, right, within this refugee, right, population or refugee youth, right, this may not be so, right, because of the institutional constraints, because of the legal restrictions, right? The refugees cannot move anyhow, and they cannot acquire land anywhere. There's also social exclusion, right? And in many cases, they're even abused, right, within these camps. And for some of you who have worked in refugee centers, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And they even have limited access to resources. So you can only talk about individual agency if the other conditions are present, right? So if you say, yes, most entrepreneurial theories assume that. However, what if entrepreneurial outcomes among refugees are primarily, so you begin by asking that question, what if among the refugees, right, success or entrepreneurial outcomes, generally speaking, are primarily determined by institutional constraints? It is then you would have started questioning, right, coming up with a philosophical mindset. So in other words, ladies and gentlemen, that will shift the discussion, right, dramatically from the gap, right? And then you'll be able to see a contribution. So the contribution becomes theoretical rather than merely contextual, where you say that you are going to study this particular group, right? For those who are in finance, I've not forgotten you, right? We can take an example of the usual thing that we know, literacy. And I've seen many of you students from the business school that study literacy. Yeah, you do it in a mechanical way, mechanical fashion as well, right? So in other words, you know, there's a traditional assumption, and that traditional assumption simply says that financial, right, literacy leads to financial inclusion. So the moment you have literacy, and by the way, you even go to companies and you begin giving them consulting services, and you say, what is missing is financial literacy, right? Like now, if you take an example of the academic, right, staff in universities, right, once they reach the area of retirement, they have issues, right? Many of them, right, they have been very successful scholars, they are professors and so forth, but let the day for retirement come from active public service, right, to another level, then you find the fellows struggling to mix within the community. So some people actually argue that, and they bring up theories, very funny theories, right, or funny assumptions that are taken for granted. You say financial literacy is the problem. Though these are all professors, fine, right? They may have studied their bachelor's, they have studied their master's, they have done their PhD, they have done research. Right, because you even find those fellows who actually teach financial literacy struggling, right, at that time of retirement. So what is the problem, right? Then you begin saying financial literacy leads to financial inclusion, or financial literacy leads to a successful transition, right, from active employment to retirement. That kind of thinking. So that is a traditional assumption, right? But then you must now move from the traditional assumption and come to another level of gap-based study, because you must identify a gap, right? And I'll be teaching you how to identify these gaps. So the gap-based study in this case, you'll be saying that few studies actually examine financial literacy among university professors, or among academic staff, or among rural women. That is very okay, right? There is a gap in that area. That is fine. But the mere fact that you have an assumption, traditional assumption that's taken for granted, and a gap, right, that you have identified from literature does not necessarily turn into what we call a research that is capable of contributing knowledge in that particular discipline, ladies and gentlemen. So in other words, you must move, right, from the gap-based study. First of all, you study with the traditional assumption. Then you have gap-based study. Now you must go beyond and reach canon by problematizing your study, right? So now in problematizing, you'll be able to say that most financial inclusion theories assume that increased financial literacy leads to greater financial participation. Right. However, you now ask yourself a question. However, what if institutional trust, right, or gender relations, or structural barriers exert stronger influence than financial literacy itself? Right. The moment you start questioning, that means that you are more or less, right, questioning a dominant assumption, right, or traditional assumption in that model, in that theory, right? And that would be a theoretical contribution, because you say, yes, we know financial literacy does this, right? Because that's what and then students are very funny. Once they know financial literacy studies have not been conducted among university professors, they will now get a questionnaire, move very fast, armed with an instrument. They look for every professor, wherever he is, and begin interrogating him. Then they will have the data. Then they enter, they get excited. Yeah? They enter the data and say, now there is a strong relationship, right? According to the beta coefficient, it was this and this and the other. And therefore, right, they provide now what we call recommendations, right? Let us mount more financial literacy campaigns among this, right? But you see, you might be coming from a wrong point of view. What if, right, what if other factors, like now, gender relations, like, for example, institutional trust, or even structural barriers, right, exert much more influence than actually what you think financial literacy will do. So in such exchange, ladies and gentlemen, around that point, you will be challenging dominant explanations, right? Ladies and gentlemen, are you hearing me that side? Hello? Hello? Can I hear
Yes,
you?
Prof, we are hearing you.
You're very clear, Prof.
Yes, yes, Professor, we are hearing.
Okay, great. I was getting worried. I thought that I'm losing you, right? So there you are challenging, right, existing what we call dominant assumptions. So we can pick another example for my colleagues who are in the procurement, right? Right. Especially those who undertake compliance studies, right? Even in the area of law, right? Legal domains. So you have this issue called public procurement, right? Public procurement is an area. So the traditional assumption in public procurement is that the more you come up with the regulations, right, the more compliance you'll get. So stronger regulations improve compliance. And that's where we are as a country, by the way. Uganda believes in generating laws all over the place, in almost every area. Recently, we had one that was challenged, right? That bill. And then I remember the governor, Bank of Uganda, right, went and made a presentation and said, ladies and gentlemen, if we bring in this thing here the way it is, right, without thinking about A, B, C, and D, we are going to have problems. Right. Then all of a sudden, someone took on X, right, and started saying the governor must be very careful, right? Such statements. Now, of course, you can see all those are mindsets. There's a general belief that, the moment we come up with these regulations, right, the laws, the rules, and so forth, everything will be okay. So let us regulate everything, right? And that's a traditional assumption. Now, if you are coming from the gap-based study, right, ladies and gentlemen, right, then you can actually identify studies from literature. How many studies do we have that actually examine procurement compliance, let's say in local governments, right? Assuming that's a context you want to take on. So you may find that they're actually very few. You have limited studies, right? So, of course, if you have limited studies, that is a gap, right? The assumption is already there, but you need to problematize, right? Problematize your study. So, in other words, in problematizing, you must think beyond and say, yes, we know, because most procurement reform theories, right, assume that stronger regulations increase compliance. That's an assumption, right? And those are reform theories. And that's why we started with the World Bank, right? Some time back. Right, have this PPDA, right, act. Then, of course, you have the body, you have all those stakeholders, right? Now you have the accounting, you have the PDE, you have you have the accounting officer, then you have the PDU unit, you have the user department, you have the contracts committee. All these are articulated very well, right, within the regulations, right, what they are supposed to do. And every now, of course, I'm aware that every now and then we have some bit of revisions, right? So the reviews are undertaken and a few things are proposed and a few things are changed. But if you're going to problematize, you can state that most procurement reform theories assume that stronger regulations will increase compliance. Then you bring in the other question of however, right? However, right, what if informal institutional norms and organizational culture exert greater influence than actually formal regulations? And I'll tell you from the studies that we have undertaken in the area of procurement, actually, these, right, informal institutional norms, right, and of course, organizational culture plus a few other things exert greater influence than formal regulations. So again, you can see if you extend your thinking this way, then you have a theoretical contribution that has become much more stronger than what you had earlier on, right? So, ladies and gentlemen, those are examples, but you can usually extend, right, those ideas to some other areas that I haven't talked about, ladies and gentlemen. So we need to understand, ladies and gentlemen, why we need to move towards problematization, given the examples that I have provided. Problematization, as we know it, produces stronger contributions because it leads to theory development, where you have new explanations emerging. We also know that problematization produces theory extension, where existing theories, right, of course, evolve, right? In other words, you are extending a particular theory by adding a few things. Like one of my PhD students that has interrogated one of the theories, and we started by undertaking a theoretical review, right? And the student has been able to publish one paper, right, with SAGE, right? And this paper is actually urging for the extension, right, of a particular theory, right? And his PhD is largely centered around that. So he was able to question and knowing the area where he's contributing knowledge or context, right? He brought in a few other things that are never discussed in literature, and they were not even a part of the theory, right? But the theory is being extended. Of course, the other problematization achievement or value of problematization is theory integration, right? So with theory integration, you will be able to integrate, right, two theories to explain a phenomenon, or even three theories to explain a phenomenon, or even four theories to explain a phenomenon. But here you must be very, very careful. Don't simply cram. And I've seen many students actually from the business school doing that. Someone will come up with something, then he says, you know, I am integrating theory A, B, C, and D. You find a student struggling with the 6 theories, 5 theories, 4 theories, 3 theories, and so forth, right? And he doesn't know why he's doing it, but it's because he has crammed it, because that's how the fellow was mentored, that you must always, and that a contribution only comes when you are integrating theories. He forgets that you can contribute through theory development. Like still one of our students who attempted to develop a theory in its initial stages using grounded theory, right? And I think that was, again, very good, right? So you can also do it through theory extension, right, where existing theories evolve, but also theory integration. And that's why students always ask a question, how many theories should I integrate? And I don't know why students keep on asking these questions. Even when you provide answers, they ask you the same question. How many theories? 2 theories, 3, 4, 5? And I've always told them that the integration of the theories, the number of theories you are going to use will depend on the problem you are investigating. The problem. And that's why you must do a thorough job in what we are discussing now. Because if you are able to get the problem right, then you'll know the number of theories you are going to use. No one will tell you that, there must be 2, 3, 4. If you begin asking whether there are 2, 3, 4, and you want to use the theory integration, right, under problematization, then it means that you're a struggling student. You do not actually know what you are doing. You don't understand your problem very well, right? That's why you are asking that question. So that is the issue, right? Your extension of, sorry, not extension, but integration, where competing perspectives are combined to provide a unified whole, right, or integrated position that can better explain a phenomenon under investigation. Right, now the other way that problematization may actually produce stronger contribution is in terms of conceptual innovation. Right, these conceptual innovations, ladies and gentlemen, come in if you are able to problematize, right, a gap, right, and problematization of the gap will see new concepts emerging, right, in your work. And those new concepts eventually become either constructs or probably they become variables, right? And of course, you know the difference between concepts, constructs, and variables, right? But they'll all be present because it is a construct, that is a concept that is broader, that will give you a construct, or it is a construct that contains many concepts, so in which case they are actually related, right, in that sense. But the operational definition places those aspects at different levels. And then from the construct, you go to variables, because at the end of the day, unless you turn your work into measurable indicators, right, it becomes a little bit difficult to move. So those are the conceptual innovations, and is problematization that actually brings in that. And then, of course, lastly, is where we have the paradigm shifts, right? Of course, through challenging the dominant assumptions. So, and that's how really paradigms emerge, right? Again, we'll be going back to the works of Karl Popper, then Kuhn, then Lactose, and the rest of them. Right, so you are able to challenge all this. Oh, I think now we better ask ourselves, what assumptions, right, before we go to, before I summarize this and go to the aspect of literature that I wanted to bring in here, right? Let me see. Okay. Oh, right. So what are those assumptions, what I call types of assumptions that can be challenged, right? As you can see, I provide you with a summary of the assumptions that you can always interrogate. And again, these are taken from the works of Alverson and Sandberg 2011, right? Who has actually come up with several categories of assumptions that researchers can challenge, right? And you are called upon to challenge those assumptions, and you must understand them, right? So the first type is what we call in-house assumptions. As you can see in our bullet there, in-house assumptions. What are those in-house assumptions, ladies and gentlemen? The in-house assumptions are assumptions that are embedded within a particular theory. Every theory has assumptions, right? Primary assumptions and secondary assumptions. Even disciplines, right? Go to economics. Economics is full of assumptions, right? And to them, all those seem to be primary assumptions, right? And those assumptions have actually stood the test of time. And the whole discipline of economics and the economics of your country is based on those assumptions, on the macroeconomic assumptions, right? And for you as an individual, on the microeconomic assumptions, right? So these are in-house assumptions, assumptions embedded within a particular theory or a particular discipline. Now, the reason why I'm using theory here is that when you're undertaking a study, right, you are going to narrow down the discipline to a knowledge area where you have interest. So these assumptions are usually accepted by scholars working within the theory, right? If you're using the resource-based theory, there are those assumptions that we know. And by the way, a mistake that usually students make, right, mistakes that they commit, right, are usually based on the assumptions. The fellow says, I'm using the resource-based theory without knowing the core assumption that resources must be rare, right? And of course, unimitable. All those assumptions, there are about 5 of them, right? Now, when you look at the study the fellow is undertaking, you don't see those characteristics in the resources they are talking about. So meaning that they have even failed to understand and utilize the theory in their work. So people think that whenever you are using a resource, any resource, just invoke the resource-based theory. So that you are now in the spirit. You assume that is automatic. The way some religions assume that, you know, God might be in a particular image somewhere, and therefore when you kneel before an image, God will jump from wherever he is and enters that, right? So there is an incarnation, reincarnation of God from there up to the image, and then, right? And those are assumptions, right, that are made. So you can actually challenge in-house assumptions. Let me give you an example, right? Again, with the resource-based theory, right, that I've already talked about. We know that the dominant assumptions under resource-based theory are that the resources must be valuable, right? 2, the resources must be rare. 3, the resources must be inimitable, right? And 4, the resources should be non-substitutable. So for you to be able to gain competitive advantage, ladies and gentlemen, those assumptions must be present in whatever you are studying. And that's why I've always advocated for the fact that you pick the book where the theory has been documented, or a soft copy on the internet, right, where you have all those assumptions and you understand them, you read the theory very well, understand the core assumptions and the challenges that have been levied against that that theory, right? So in terms of problematization, ladies and gentlemen, at this level, right? You begin asking yourself, what if resource value depends more on governance quality? Because the value of a resource may depend on governance. If we are talking about water as a natural resource, and you are dealing with the, let's say, water in Lake Victoria or River Nile or somewhere, can someone help me mute that student? Right? If you're talking about that natural resource, the governance of that resource will determine the value of the resource. Right. And in many cases, some resources actually. Dixon, can you? Okay, Musinguzi, now Musinguzi. Anyway, what if the value of the resources, right, or the resource depends on governance quality and probably institutional context also, right? Then actually the intrinsic resource characteristics, like the resource being valuable, rare, substitutable, things like that, non-substitutable, right? So if you are able to indicate that actually the resource you are talking about, the value of the resource, in order to create competitive advantage, right? Like a human being, the human resource, governance of the human resource matters a lot. Right? Because you might have a good resource, but you don't know how to. So don't simply take these as resources and you start using the resource-based theory. And then you say, well, but there was no relationship between this and the other. And yet the other studies have found a positive relationship. Therefore, our work contradicts this theory. No, you did not understand where to use that particular resource. So what you do in this case, you problematize, right? And challenge the internal assumption, or what we call the in-house assumption for resource-based theory. Because the resource value, according to you, in order to generate competitive advantage, will depend on governance quality and institutional context. Let me give you a second example, right, of human capital, right? So we know that we have human capital theory. For those who are in economics and also business, you know very well how you use that theory, and you believe that education improves productivity. I've seen many studies, including the data collected by WUBOS, having years of education and things like that, and assuming that actually the number of years you spend in school will give you a qualification that will produce what we call, that will create improved productivity. And that's an assumption. Right. Now, for me, in terms of problematization at that level, you simply state that really possessing educational credentials, right, primarily may actually signal social status rather than productivity. I've seen, for some of you have been following posts on X, right? There is someone, right? I think that gentleman was challenging one of the, I think MP, if I'm not mistaken, right? But this is an academic, right? The fellow is in academia. So we woke up one morning and said, you people, you don't know, I have all of these. I've acquired the bachelor's from this prestigious university. I acquired a master's from Europe in this area. I also acquired this kind of thing from, now I have a PhD, I've done this and the other. You tell me you are an MP, and the fellow was talking about an MP, I know him very well, right? Says you have been in the parliament, you've done this and the other, but what have you, right? What is your contribution? What is it that you have and you know that I don't know, right? So you can see, Pauline, can someone help me? Please help me mute Pauline. Ladies and gentlemen, the ones I gave 3 people host rights. Just help me. I do not have to remind you. You'll be seeing these fellows misbehaving every now and then, right? So I was just giving that example of the MP versus my friend who is in academia, right? That challenge I saw on X, right, in social media all over the place, right? So my friend, the academic, assumes that human capital theory, right, where you begin talking about education, actually improves productivity, right? There's another example I'll be using, not today, but another day, when we'll be talking about someone again who was writing, I think he's a Nigerian. I said it's time for the African academic to wake up, not to count journal articles and things like that published, but to do A, B, C, and D. So it's not a subject for discussion now, but later on, if I remember, maybe tomorrow, I'll bring it up or another day, right? So if you're going to problematize, right, you are challenging that in-house assumption within the human capital theory, then you begin realizing that educational credentials, right, may actually signal social status, like the other fellow who was talking about these things, rather than productivity, right, at the end of the day. So this question is a core assumption of the human capital theory, ladies and gentlemen. The other assumption is the root metaphor. Root metaphor, that's the second point there, right? What we call root metaphor assumptions. And root metaphor assumptions are actually fundamental ways of viewing reality, right? And we've got various ways of viewing reality, right? And as we saw the other time when we were looking at paradigms, if you're positivistic or logical positivism, you belong to that movement, right? Or a constructivist. Someone asked a question, right, about children who were learning during COVID-19 period, right? So, of course, he was wondering what kind of paradigm, right? And then we did discuss that because of the kinds of theories that he was applying. We actually saw that it was coming from the constructivist, right, paradigms, ladies and gentlemen. So you can see that these fundamental ways of viewing reality, ladies and gentlemen, right, may actually shape entire theories that are developed in that area, right? So all theories will be shaped by that. And I can give you a very simple example. One thinking is for those from organizational studies, you can look at organization as a machine, right? And you know what usually happens within organizations? Excuse me. Right. So if you've been studying organizations and you're in the field of organizational sciences, right, you will discover that actually most studies or most management theories, they actually view organizations as machines. Most organizational theories, right? And I'll be sharing with you one or two, right? So if that is a dominant thinking, then you problematize, right? And then you say, well, what if these organizations resemble complex, adaptive systems, right? What if they take on that, right, perspective, right, rather than really behaving as machines? So, of course, the moment you begin thinking that way, right, and you are able to adduce evidence, then it means that you are coming up with different explanations. So we do not have to continue looking at organizations as machines, but we can look at them as complex adaptive systems, because organizations adapt, right, within the changing environment, right? You can take another example from economics, right, where a market is taken as a rational system, right? So we know from economics that markets are treated as rational systems, right? So now your problematization from this root metaphor is that you begin asking yourself, what if markets behave more like social networks, right? So they behave more like social networks, and therefore they are driven by relationships and trust. Therefore, this assumption of rationality may not actually be correct. So in other words, you are questioning a root metaphor. So what happens in this case is that theoretical implications become very, very, very substantial, ladies and gentlemen. The other one is what you call the paradigm assumptions, right? And of course, these are assumptions that are shaped by the entire research tradition, like the positivistic paradigm, right? Where you assume objective reality, right? That objective reality exists, we can measure it. And I always hear students say, now you see my whatever is objective and so forth, is therefore it can be measured, right? That means you are coming from that positivistic thinking. What if, for example, organizational performance, if that's what you are talking about, which you think is very objective, supposing that organizational performance is socially constructed and interpreted differently by different stakeholders, right? And that's why when you go into area of entrepreneurship, you find businesses that have made losses for the last 20 years, right? But those small businesses do not actually exit the market, or even big businesses. They don't exit. Why? Because there's another reason, right, why that institution must continue existing. Therefore, it means that you are looking at reality differently, not from an objective perspective, but a socially constructed perspective, right? And for you, the existence of a business might be a symbol of prestige, right? And that's a different perspective altogether. So in other words, you are challenging paradigm level assumptions. Now, the other one, it would be the ideological assumptions. Again, I'm giving you one example because of time, right? We may not be able to go through the rest of all the components that I thought would, right? Because I see time is running. Ideological assumptions, or maybe I skip those ideological assumptions. But anyway, ideological assumptions are rooted in broader social beliefs and values, like gender and leadership and so forth, right? Issues of meritocracy are also there, right? Where you believe that success reflects merit. What if structural inequalities significantly shape success opportunities? Anyway, there are others like field assumptions, right? Those are assumptions that are widely accepted within an entire field, right? So you can take those assumptions for granted, but those can be challenged, right? Anyway, I think let me more or less stop there because I do not want to lose time, right? We need to finalize this. Otherwise, we may end up not completing the problematization concept. So if you're going to compare gap spotting and problematization, of course, the dimensions would be in terms of the central question that is being asked, right? For gap spotting, it is what is missing, but then problematization is what assumptions should be questioned. In terms of contribution for gap spotting, the contribution is incremental. Under problematization, it is transformative. Your contribution is transformative. Focus, right? In terms of gap spotting, you go into literature reviews, right? But of course, under problematization, you go into underlying assumptions. The theoretical contribution or impact. Under gap spotting, the contribution or the impact is usually modest, but under the problematization, it is often substantial. When you go into, for example, the results, right? Typical results, under gap spotting, you are talking about another study to be undertaken, but under problematization, you provide new ways of thinking, right? So, ladies and gentlemen, we must move from that area, right, of gap spotting and transit and go to problematization. Right. So, of course, there are so many reasons why I think you should move, right, from gap spotting to problematization, ladies and gentlemen. It's because strong doctoral research will rarely emerge from asking questions like what has not been studied, right? And that's the gap spotting. But it will emerge from asking, why do we believe what we believe? Why, to begin with? Why do we believe that the sun rises from the east and sets in the west every day? Right? Why do we? Why? Right. Of course, the other one is in terms of what assumptions are shaping current explanations, and you must know those assumptions. Right. What if those assumptions are incomplete? Or what if those assumptions are incorrect? And that is very important. So doctoral research, ladies and gentlemen, should therefore view literature not merely as a source of gaps, but as a source of assumptions to interrogate, ladies and gentlemen. So once we do that, then we know that we shall be moving to another level, right, of thinking, meaning that we are able to do a great job, ladies and gentlemen. So, ladies and gentlemen, allow me, right, at this point, as we can see from this slide, the last bullet simply tells us that really this problematization and gap spotting, they are inspired by literature. As I said, at an opportune moment, we shall go through literature review. Hope so. But if I don't, allow me to say something here as I move towards closing. This might take us possibly 20 minutes. And then from there, we shall go into discussions, ladies and gentlemen. And that will be the end of the lecture. Then we can take it over from there. I will not be able to go to another area that I had thought would be able to cover. Right. So since this is inspired by literature, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to take you through this area of what literature review is, right? So you must be engaged with the literature, right? Because all the things that we are talking about actually come from literature review, ladies and gentlemen. So as you can see, literature review occupies a central position, a central place in scholarly research. And for some of you who may not have known, actually over 75%, if not 85%, of your thesis will contain literature review in one way or the other, and presented differently depending on the purpose of that particular section. For example, if you go to the introduction section or the introduction chapter, largely you have literature review, only that you do not know that what is presented there is literature review. Even when you begin talking about the context, right? Context, you are talking about the sector in Uganda, the manufacturing sector, because your study is in the manufacturing sector, or education sector. What are you doing? You are reviewing sector-specific literature. It is not entirely scholarly, but you need it for that section. It is literature. So that your introduction will have both, right? Scholarly literature, actually, it's not only scholarly, but you have theoretical literature. Your introduction chapter has theoretical literature, it has empirical literature, and it has contextual literature, right? And that's why you pick evidence. When you're talking about the background to the study, you are talking about statement of the problem, you're talking about purpose of the study, all those things emerge from literature. So your chapter 1 is purely a review of literature and being able to identify a gap and a practical problem. And even a practical problem can be identified by reviewing sector-specific literature, ladies and gentlemen. So literature review occupies a central place in scholarly research. It is not merely a preliminary stage, as some of you think, and then you begin summarizing everything that you come across. No, it is a sophisticated intellectual exercise through which actually researchers engage with existing knowledge. Researchers engage, right, with that knowledge through evaluation of its strengths and limitations, and also be able to establish the scholarly foundations for your own investigation or for our own investigation, ladies and gentlemen. So if you come up with a very well-written literature review, ladies and gentlemen, then you are able to demonstrate what you call a mastery of your field, right? You are able to reveal the current state of knowledge in that area, and you are able to identify unresolved issues in that particular discipline, and also justify the need for further inquiry. So when we say that literature is important, that's exactly what we mean. And again, taking the ideas of Golden-Biddle and Locke, right? Again, I'll send you that book, right? Golden-Biddle and Locke actually believe that literature review is important to our understanding of the discipline or the domain, because we do not simply review literature, but we actively construct literature and also actively problematize literature. So construction of literature is very important, and problematization of literature is very important. So as we go through this, do not forget what literature review is all about, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, we look at literature review in terms of those three aspects. It's an active exercise. A review is not really just reading as if you are reading notes or a story, right? With a view of retelling that story, but it's an active exercise. Not only is it active, but also critical and constructive, right? So we call it active because researchers engage directly with knowledge, right? Because you engage directly with knowledge, it is an active exercise. You search for relevant studies, right? And that's a job. It's not very simple, right? Looking for journal articles on the internet, it may take you days, it may take you weeks, it may take you months, right? In fact, right from the time when you start doing your PhD, up to the time when you submit your thesis for examination, you should be actively involved in review, constant review of literature, because the issue you are investigating might actually have been investigated by another person without knowing, right? Because we don't want you to duplicate studies, and that study might have been conducted in the same setting where you are undertaking the study. So that's why it is active, right? You are always looking for journal articles, right? And remember, you must pick relevant journal articles. Not everything you find on the internet is useful. There's a lot of trash on the internet, right? And then you will be able to compare competing arguments, right? So in other words, you are able to identify the arguments, and these arguments might be competing. And then you identify the conceptual relationships, right, within these particular studies that you are looking at or that you have managed to download, and within the constructs that you are studying, right? So therefore, this literature review search is not a passive exercise. It's not a passive consumption of knowledge, right? But an active person, you become an active person in scholarly discourse or scholarly pursuit. So that is why we say it's active. It is also critical because literature must be evaluated rather than being merely reported. We don't expect you to simply report literature, but to evaluate, right? And that evaluation is very, very important. And that's why for some of you have done systematic literature review, we use Prisma, the preferred reporting, right? Instructions for systematic and meta-analytic reviews. So Prisma is actually an abbreviation of that. So meaning that you, first of all, there's a methodology of identifying journal articles, the ones you are going to include, the ones you are going to exclude, and then you start analyzing and writing and constructing. You reconstruct the argument. So journal articles become the data, right? They contain the data that you analyze. Of course, again, depending on the paradigm that you are using, you can do a great job in that area. So researchers examine so many things from literature. They examine the assumptions underlying those theories. They assess methodological strengths and weaknesses, right? They compare findings across studies. And of course, they identify inconsistencies. And that's the critical exercise that I'm talking about, right? And of course, excuse me, inconsistencies, limitations, right? And of course, unanswered questions, right? So criticality in this sense involves intellectual judgment, ladies and gentlemen, rather than criticism for its own sake, right? But of course, you know, conjectures and refutations, what Karl Popper says. Now, of course, constructive exercise is a third component there, right? It's constructive because the literature review builds an intellectual foundation for the research project. And through synthesis and interpretation, researchers develop conceptual arguments. You are going to develop those conceptual arguments. You are going to develop theoretical positions, ladies and gentlemen, and you're going to develop research questions, right? You're going to develop hypotheses, and you're going to develop theoretical and conceptual frameworks that will support the central thesis. So at the end of the day, the conceptual and theoretical model that you're going to develop or framework will support your central thesis. So that's why central thesis is very important because, right, this is an important part where you are able to mobilize arguments and position them in a particular fashion so as to compel researchers to listen to you and even to read your work, ladies and gentlemen, right? So it is very, very important, even when you have reviewed literature and you have identified gaps, that you are able to write and construct that literature very well. There's a constructive bit, ladies and gentlemen. So that brings us to construction of literature, right? And that's where I'm going to end construction and problematizing literature, ladies and gentlemen, right? Now, as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, Golden-Biddle and Locke, right, who argue that literature review actively constructs research, right, in the various fields or in the various domains. So if you do a good job in terms of reviewing a literature, you will be able to actively construct, right, the field. You'll be able to actively construct, right, your argument in that particular area. Now, a field, ladies and gentlemen, does not exist as a a ready-made entity waiting to be discovered. That we already have knowledge, you have reached the apex of knowledge, so let's go and discover it. No, it's not discovering knowledge, but you are going to construct, once you undertake critical review of literature, right, you are going to construct literature. So you are going to create a particular representation of the field through the selection, right, of literature, through the organization of literature, and through interpretation of literature. So in other words, in your area, specific area, you are able to select journal articles, you are able to organize, and you are able to interpret prior scholarships that exist in that particular area, ladies and gentlemen. So when researchers write this section of literature, depending on where they are presenting it, whether it's in the introduction or the literature reviews proper or the discussion, right, because you find literature reviews scattered within your entire thesis, doctoral thesis, right, you make deliberate decisions about which studies to include. You make deliberate decisions about which theories to emphasize, which concepts, for example, to connect, and which debates to foreground. So what debates am I going to use? Because not all debates will be included in the same study. And sometimes I see students having very complicated models, and I wonder whether what they are doing is actually correct at that material time. So these decisions that I'm talking about, ladies and gentlemen, shape how readers understand the phenomenon under investigation, and you must do a good piece of work in this area. So let's take a very simple example, ladies and gentlemen. For those students who are in the area of procurement, supposing you're examining procurement performance, right? And you want to construct the field around institutional theory, around governance theory, around accountability, and maybe public administration, if that is your objective. And you have another researcher who has the same topic, right? And he wants to study the same topic, but to construct, right, his own field around supply chain management and probably strategic management or even resource-based theory. Both are studying procurement performance, fine, yet each person is constructing a different intellectual field, right, that must be filled. So the issue of having the same topic should never worry you at all. Unless you have a duplicate mind, ladies and gentlemen, you will never produce the same piece of work. It is impossible. You can't say the same things. You'll be saying different things. First of all, you might be coming from different paradigms, right? Then too, the theories you are using, they are totally different. Even the assumptions that you are challenging are different, right, at that level. So, and that's why you need to always share your work with your colleagues. Don't fear that your colleagues will copy your work. It cannot happen. They can't work. They cannot. And that's why Golden-Biddle and Locke identify 3 principal strategies through which researchers actually construct literature. And those are the ones that you see on the slides here: synthesized coherence, progressive coherence, and non-coherence. Then from the construction of literature, we problematize the literature, ladies and gentlemen. Now, of course, each strategy, as you can see, provides a different representation of the field, and of course serves a different rhetorical purpose in this case. Right, so let's begin with the synthesized coherence, right, ladies and gentlemen, and then from there we shall move to the next level, right? What is this thing called synthesized coherence, ladies and gentlemen? As you can see, this synthesized coherence occurs, right, when researchers bring together, right, bodies of literature that initially appear unrelated, right? And the scholars attempt to demonstrate that these bodies of knowledge or literature share common themes, they share common assumptions, they share common concepts and findings or even methodological approaches. Right. So in other words, we go to literature, but when we go to literature, we identify those particular journal articles that are very important. And after identifying those journal articles about the same concept that you want to study, it might be resilience, by the way. So you look for these. Some of the papers will be taken from psychology, others will be taken from humanitarian grounds, others might be taken from family studies, others are taken from. So in other words, you pick all those, right? But you see, they are coming from different disciplines. Right, they appear unrelated. Someone will say, but where are you contributing knowledge? You are contributing knowledge to humanitarian. Why are you studying these things in family studies? So they will not understand why you are doing it. And you must tell them, right, that you're actually using synthesized coherence. Your contribution will eventually go to maybe what should I say? Climate resilience. Maybe you are dealing with the farmers, right? So it will go there, but because you do not have an established body of knowledge in that area yet, and the area is new, and you are constructing knowledge in that area, so you go to those fields where research has been done and pick ideas. I think I gave an example of homeostasis last time. Homeostasis, right? A concept that is well developed in medicine, right? But you pick those ideas, the concepts, and the methodologies, the common themes, the assumptions, the findings, and the methodological approaches. You pick them from there, right? And then you highlight points of agreement in order to demonstrate the need for further investigation. So as you can see, the purpose of the synthesis here, ladies and gentlemen, is to try and create coherence, right, from the fragmented pieces that exist out there. So in other words, here we do not aim at emphasizing differences. No, that's not our purpose. We actually emphasize similarities, and we highlight similarities and points of convergence, right? And I mean, across these diverse streams of scholarship. I'll pick something from physics, something from whatever. I say, yes, right? And then you highlight points of convergence and similarities in order to construct the knowledge base, because you don't have sufficient journal articles to dismiss at this level. So I can give you an example, another example, right? A study of organizational resilience, and I've been using this quite often, right? So the study on organizational resilience, they may actually draw, right, upon, for example, strategic management, right? You pick journal articles from there. You pick from crisis management. You pick journal articles from organizational learning. You pick from leadership. You pick from knowledge management. You pick from risk management. These are just examples. Now, of course, although these literatures appear distinct, right, from the first side, because you have management, risk management, you have leadership, they seem to be coming from different domains, as you can see, right? So whereas they actually appear distinct, they all emphasize one major point, and that point is adaptation. Go to all journal articles published on resilience, then you see adaptation coming up. You see issues of flexibility emerging. You see issues of learning coming up. You see issues of resource mobilization during uncertainty also emerging. So through now synthesis, these separate streams become part of coherent explanation of what we call resilience, ladies and gentlemen. So synthesized coherence, therefore, performs a number of functions, ladies and gentlemen. One, a function of integrating fragmented knowledge, right? Number two, you are able to reveal so many conceptual, what I call hidden conceptual relationships. Three, you are able to establish common foundations across disciplines. And then next, you may also be able to create a comprehensive understanding of the phenomenon because you are bringing a number of issues there. So as you can see, the hallmark of synthesized coherence is the search for agreement, not disagreement, right? And the researcher asks what common story emerges from these different studies, right? And the answer to that question, ladies and gentlemen, often forms the basis for conceptual framework. And that conceptual framework acts as a foundation for the investigation that is being carried out, or even for future investigations, ladies and gentlemen. So that's one way of constructing literature, synthesize coherence. The second one, ladies and gentlemen, is progressive coherence, right? Progressive coherence. And as you can see, progressive coherence here will present literature as a cumulative and evolving body of knowledge, right? In other words, knowledge accumulates over time. If you're talking about the double entry system, for example, for those who are in accounting, you start with Lucas Pacioli, right? I think must have been in 18 something, right? Then you had so many other people contributing towards double entry system. Up to now, it's a dominant belief, right? For every debit, you must have a credit. For every credit, you must have a corresponding debit entry, that kind of thing, that kind of thinking, right? So that is cumulative knowledge growth. By the way, you can also add to the growing double entry system because that window of research has never been, right, closed. Right, so you can go there, interrogate, and come up with the new knowledge through what we call progressive coherence. But even those who want to use the synthesized coherence, you can, but I can assure there's a lot of literature on double entry system. Right, there's a lot of literature. So you can probably use progressive coherence, or you can bring up the other concept of non-coherence, and that's the third way. So here you depict literature in terms of cumulative knowledge growth, and even consensus of perspectives, ladies and gentlemen. So let me just give you another example of technology acceptance, right? Because that's what we are, many of us are familiar with, especially from technology, right? Here you can trace the historical evolution of ideas, right? I've told you can trace the double entry system, but you can also interrogate this one, right? Technology acceptance. So you come up with a historical evolution of ideas, and then after that you demonstrate how the present study extends that trajectory. So if we take technology acceptance research, we see that the technology acceptance model actually gives us an excellent piece of work to think about, right? It actually gives an excellent example because the field evolved from the theory of reasoned action, right, to the theory of planned behavior, then to the technology acceptance model. You may not know that Davis, in his technology acceptance model, he actually borrowed a lot from theory of reasoned action by Asgen and Fishburne. So you had the Fishburne who was doing his research on the other side, and you had also Asgen doing his other research on the other side. So they merged both Fishburne and Asgen and came up with a theory of reasoned action, sorry, planned behavior and reasoned action. Right. So from there now, these technology fellows were also very creative. So they come up with a term model coming from those theories. So the technology acceptance model, they have term, then you have term 2 and term 3, right? So from the theory of reasoned action to the theory of planned behavior, then to the technology acceptance model, right? That was term. Then you had to go to term 2. Then you go to term 3. And eventually, the unified theory of acceptance and use of technology that we call without. So unless you understand that evolution, as a student, you are going to wrongly use, right, those theories. Someone will say, me, I've used the without, I've combined it with the term, I've used it with the theory of reasoned action, things like, without knowing exactly where they are operating. So each model, as you can see here, the ones I've given you, sought to explain, right, or even improve the explanatory capacity of its predecessors. So in other words, the fellows who came up with the theory of planned behavior, they wanted to improve the theory of reasoned action. The fellows who developed the technology acceptance model, right, they wanted to improve theory of planned behavior, theory of reasoned action, right? The one with the without thought that he could actually improve now the other one. So as you can see, that is a field. In other words, when you're using progressive coherence, you give us historical development so that the current research is constructed as the next logical step in this collective and growing understanding of the topic that you are investigating, ladies and gentlemen. So as you can see, progressive coherence here, right, emphasizes 3 characteristics, ladies and gentlemen. First, there's what we call cumulative knowledge growth. Knowledge builds over time rather than emerging suddenly. So one field builds on the other. Second is what we call consensus of perspectives and methods. As the fields usually mature, scholars, ladies and gentlemen, increasingly agree about important concepts. Right, they agree about important variables. They agree about methodological standards. Right, and that's why you have scholars coming together, right, to develop a new framework that probably better explain the previous models or theories that they had developed. Now, of course, the third aspect is a focused inquiry, right? Focused inquiry. And as you can see, focused inquiry is important because research gradually develops a coherent tradition. And that coherent tradition is directed towards understanding a particular phenomenon. So as you can see, the purpose of progressive coherence, ladies and gentlemen, is to position the current study as the next logical step in the growing understanding of this particular topic. So the literature review, therefore, tells a story of intellectual progress and it demonstrates how the proposed study contributes to cumulative knowledge growth, ladies and gentlemen. The third one that you need to also understand is non-coherence, ladies and gentlemen. And as you can see, non-coherence, again, let me just put all the information on this slide so that we shall leave it at once and then problematize literature, right? So non-coherence, as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, unlike the synthesized and progressive coherence that we have just seen, non-coherence constructs literature around disagreement, right? Around contradictions, around contestations, around unresolved debates. And when you go to literature, ladies and gentlemen, I can assure you these unresolved debates will be there. These contestations are there in literature, and that's why you should not take things for granted the way we are told in church to believe, right? And that's the concept, only believe, right? All things are possible, only believe. When it comes to scholarship, that's not it, right? There you believe, you know, and that's why you have different interpretations, incidentally. right? If you pick, for example, from the Bible, the burning bush experience, right? Someone will tell you a story about burning bush, right? And he has a different topic, right? He's preaching something totally, right? But he's using the burning bush experience. And he will say that is revelation. The other one will also have another perspective, but using the burning bush experience, right? So all those things come in here, right? In research, yes, we question, right? And we come up with the possible explanations. But remember, they must also be able to resolve, right, the problems that we are confronted with in life. So as you can see, under non-coherence, the field is portrayed as important but unsettled. This area is very important, but the area is unsettled, right? So in other words, here we emphasize competing explanations. We emphasize contradictory findings. We emphasize methodological disputes that exist. We emphasize conceptual disagreements. And the objective is not to demonstrate consensus, which we did under, right, progressive coherence. That's what we did. Here, we actually emphasize something that is totally different. We want to reveal tensions that justify further inquiry. And that is very important. So, of course, this is an issue. Let me just give you an example here, right? Organizational size and innovation. For some of you who have been studying innovation, right? You've come across literature on innovation and organizational size, right? So some studies, for example, suggest that larger organizations are more innovative because they possess greater resources, right? And that is an accepted finding that is in literature, right? That the bigger the organization, the better, because you have more resources and you can channel these resources into innovations, right? So you become innovative because of the resources that you have. Now, other studies, ladies and gentlemen, right, argue that smaller organizations are more innovative, right, because they are more flexible and entrepreneurial compared to those big organizations that have existed for some time, because they have systems and you cannot, right, navigate those systems. So, and they may not be entrepreneurial. So there's an argument that actually small organizations do this, right? And of course, that is now a contradictory evidence, but you'll find other scholars who do not find any significant relationship between these two. So these contradictions, ladies and gentlemen, that I've highlighted, certainly create a contested field, right? A field that has competing explanations, a field that is filled with the disputes, the debates, or even contradictions. So that is what happens, right? Now, examples are bound to occur, right, across disciplines, ladies and gentlemen. Debates persist regarding the effects, right, of many things that that have been discovered. Let me just give you an example, right? In economics, for example, you find debates regarding the effects of minimum wage. And recently I heard, I think, I don't know whether this is an individual from parliament who actually made a statement and said, we need now a minimum wage, right? Because minimum wage will increase employment, right? Now that could be a rational argument in economics, right? But in psychology, scholars disagree, right, about this concept. But even in economics, debates are there, right? Not all scholars agree the same thing. So we can pick another example, right? Maybe now we pick it from psychology, yes, right? About the relative influence of genetics and environment on behavior, right? There's a belief that genetics, right, and the environment may actually shape behavior. right, of individuals, and that is in psychology. Right, so you have people who believe in that, and the studies have been conducted, right? But you have also scholars who disagree with the same. Right, in public administration, for example, right, you have again debates about decentralization, improving service delivery, that the more you decentralize, then service delivery will be better. I remember meeting some time back about when we are having an international conference. I met someone from the government of Sudan, that is Khartoum, before the collapse of Bashir's empire, right? And the fellow was saying, I know that many countries in Africa here, or world over, and the World Bank, right, has come up with the belief that you see public procurement, right, must be decentralized. Right. The fellow said, but for us from the Ministry of Finance, right, in Khartoum, we do not believe that, because really government expenditure, it is a very important macroeconomic tool, and therefore we must manage this aspect. So there's no, you can now begin asking entities, right, to begin spending, planning and spending on your behalf as government. So central government must do this. Right, and so for them, they actually resisted that kind of thinking, but I don't know where they are now. Right, so that is an element that is very, very important. So you have arguments and counter arguments. So as you can see, non-coherence, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see from these slides that are presented to you, is valuable because disagreement often signals opportunities for what I call significant contributions. And when scholars disagree, ladies and gentlemen, important questions remain unresolved. And the literature review, therefore, becomes a map of competing perspectives, and your study should be positioned as an effort to clarify or reconcile or resolve these debates and disputes, ladies and gentlemen. Having said that, ladies and gentlemen, again, I'm assuming that you can do literature review or identify the gaps. You'll be able to construct this literature and also problematize the literature, ladies and gentlemen. So after you have constructed your literature from the three perspectives, you must move, right, from the literature construction, right, using synthesized coherence or progressive coherence or non-coherence towards problematization of literature. And according to Golden-Biddle, there are three ways of problematizing literature, right? So as you can see, as I said earlier on, constructing a field is only half of the literature review, right, process. So you need to move, right, beyond constructing literature to problematization of literature so that your study contributes. Others, without problematizing, your study will never. That's why we started with the gap spotting. You identify the gaps in literature, but what is next? You must problematize, right, literature. And I showed you the way you could do that, but I also wanted to approach it from the literature review perspective so that you know exactly what we mean. So researchers must demonstrate why further research is necessary. And you can only justify that if you are able to problematize literature. So this is achieved through problematization, as you can see, of literature, and there are three ways of doing so, ladies and gentlemen. But before I go through those three ways, problematization refers to the process of identifying limitations or the process of identifying deficiencies or the process of identifying contradictions or the process of identifying weaknesses in existing knowledge. Right, so problematization simply refers to that. The process you go through to identify those, as you've just seen on the previous slide. We go through a process to identify all these, right? Now, of course, that is it, right? You identify that, right? but you must be able to construct. So you construct answers to the question like, what does the field currently look like? That's a question that you must ask yourself. Right, this field that we are talking about, how does it look like? Right? What does the field currently look like? Right? So this is very important because in problematization, right, these issues become important, right? Problematization refers to that process where you identify, right, your limitations, deficiencies, and so forth. In construction, yes, we know how the field looks like, right? But you answer why another study is necessary. Remember, right, problematization is justification, right, of your study. Why is another study necessary? Why is another study important? And that's why Golden-Biddle gives us these three, right? Incomplete, problematization through incomplete, inadequate, and incommensurate. So these three things are very important. So we shall go through one by one. We start with the incomplete, right? Right. And I think you can see what incompleteness means in this case, right? Just a moment. One by one, you know, click on camera, so you'll see whatever is what's happening. Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, sorry for the interruption. Right. But we are looking at problematization. Right. So, as you can see, Golden-Biddle and Locke, right, identifies these three. Let me just take you back. Incomplete, inadequate, and incommensurate, right? So these three principles, they actually form problematization, ladies and gentlemen, right? And incompleteness is one of them, inadequacy is another one, and incommensurate. So what is incomplete? Let me just, my slides are not moving, right? Okay. So what do we cover under this area, right, where we say that literature is incomplete, right? So as you can see, incompleteness, right, from our slide here, portrays literature as unfinished, right? So in other words, existing knowledge is viewed as valuable, right? Because we know that this is existing knowledge that exists, yes. It is very important and useful, it's valuable actually. It's fundamentally correct, right? But important aspects remain unexplored, right? So of course here you use this aspect, right, of incompleteness when you are constructing, right, and problematizing literature, because your purpose is to extend knowledge or to augment existing knowledge. So that's why we are saying that the research in this case seeks to augment the field or fill a gap. So that's why under, right, construction, we're able to look at progressive, synthesized, and non-coherence. And where you have identified all those gaps or cumulative knowledge growth, etc. But now we must problematize. So the objective of problematizing is to demonstrate the need for this research. In other words, when we use incompleteness, we seek to extend the field because the understanding, the explanations, etc., right, are not fully finished yet. So we want to extend knowledge. We want to elaborate. We want to augment existing knowledge, right? So our objective in this area is not to challenge, right, the existing mechanism. So of course, you can see here, the literature may be incomplete because certain contexts, as we saw under gap spotting, certain concepts, certain contexts, certain populations or variables or mechanisms or whatever it is have not been examined, right? For example, right, if we could take this, studies, right, in the area of leadership. So some studies may actually demonstrate that servant leadership improves employee performance, right? And you may also discover that little may be known, right, about, for example, the mechanisms, right, through which servant leadership will improve employee performance. And in your case, you have identified a variable that seems to be missing in literature, and that is psychological safety, right? So in other words, you want to bring this kind of variable into the fore. So you want to bring in the mechanism. So the contribution here, ladies and gentlemen, is generated through incompleteness, right? And this incompleteness brings in some kind of extension. So researchers fill meaningful gaps without questioning dominant paradigm, but by introducing something that has not been studied, right, in this kind of relationship. And that becomes a mechanism. So if it is a mechanism through which servant leadership, for example, explains employee performance, then that becomes a mediator, right? So that will now be what we call knowledge being incomplete in this particular field. So the research in this case will seek to augment the field. So you are adding something or filling a gap that that exists. So here you are not really questioning those paradigms, but that's one way of looking at things. So the contribution here is in terms of extension, right? Because you are filling a gap, right? So, and this is one of the relatively conservative and easy way to justify, right, incompleteness, right, in problematizing literature. And it remains one of the most common form of doctoral problematization. If you look at students, they usually have so many mediators, right, bring them into the models and even moderators, right? Others go to the extent of having moderated mediation, mediated moderation, right, and so forth, right? They have one-way or two-way or three-level mediation, which can be a little bit complex. But I believe that you have the tools that you can use to justify that kind of study, right? So the other one that comes from Golden-Biddle is inadequate, right? So inadequacy here portrays literature, ladies and gentlemen, as limited, right? Because it excludes important perspectives, important contexts, important assumptions, or important explanatory frameworks, right? So you find that a study has been undertaken, or studies have been undertaken in that field that have taken largely a positivistic, right, paradigm, right, and they have not even thought about the constructivist element. So in other words, that means the existing studies are inadequate in explaining because they overlook, right, and ignore some of those perspectives. So that's why here literature is portrayed as excluding alternative perspectives. So meaning that the problem here is not merely that knowledge is unfinished, but rather the current explanations that exist in literature provide only a partial understanding of reality, and yet you want to have a comprehensive perspective. So as a researcher, ladies and gentlemen, here you will identify, right, neglected perspectives, right, and then introduce alternative ways of understanding the phenomenon. And that's what we are saying in the second bullet. The research aims to contribute by bringing this oversight into view and introduce different views and framework. Let me give you an example, right? Many motivational studies or many motivational theories were actually developed in Western individualistic societies. You know, Western societies are individualistic. Now, a researcher may argue that these theories inadequately explain motivation within collectivist African or Asian cultures, because our cultures are collectivist in nature. If you are able to justify that they are collectivist, then you'll be there. Right. So, in other words, you are bringing this oversight into view. Right. And that's why you want to undertake the study within our society, right? So that you understand. And the framework might be totally different, right? Because the collectivist perspective and the concept and construct is missing, right, in the studies within the Western world. So even procurement research, right, has been dominated by legal compliance perspectives, right? So they actually overlook things like culture, stakeholder relationships, public value considerations, etc. So that is really inadequate research, right, establishment. So you can actually problematize literature in terms of inadequacy. The last one, ladies and gentlemen, right, is incommensurate, right? And after this, ladies and gentlemen, I will just give you a summative statement that will bring this to an end, right? So incommensurability, right? Incommensurability, right? So research is incommensurate. And by the way, this represents the strongest and most radical form of problematization. So if you're not very strong, ladies and gentlemen, do not attempt to get into this area. Here you need to be a person with a thick skin, right, if you want to get into this area, right? So in this area, you will argue as a researcher that existing theories, right, existing assumptions, existing concepts, or even paradigms, right, they are fundamentally flawed, right? As you can see, the first bullet there, existing literature is portrayed as not simply incomplete, but wrong or even misguided in some way. Right. So that's why I told you that this represents the strongest and most radical form of problematization. You can actually do it at the doctoral level. Do not say this is for other people. You can review these theories. You can review paradigms. You can review all these things. Right. And then find inconsistencies, like the Gettier problem that I told you in philosophy of methods. Right. Gettier was a student, right, of philosophy, right? And he examined the philosophical perspectives that existed. And he constructed a very simple question that challenged the way philosophers were thinking, right? And of course, they reacted by finding a ways of introducing what we call the main hypothesis and auxiliary hypothesis, so that they now preserve the main hypothesis and keep on revising the auxiliary hypothesis, right? So, and the arguments that are developed along those perspectives actually come from there, ladies and gentlemen. So here, the researcher, right, as we can see, seeks not merely to extend or improve existing knowledge, but to challenge and replace prevailing assumptions. Right. So I'll give you an example, right? And again, as I said, you must have a a very thick skin here if you want to jump into this area, right? Like we are attempting to get into the concept of scarcity, right? So we know the backlash, right, this will create, but we are prepared for it. So if we go into behavioral economics, ladies and gentlemen, we also have a classical example, right, where traditional economics has actually tended to assume what we call rational decision making, right? And the belief by this, by the behavioral economists, is that decision making is frequently shaped by cognitive biases, emotions, and heuristics, right? Now, the challenge here was directed not at missing variables, but at the foundational assumption of rationality itself. Right. So rational decision making can exist, but do not forget that there are those fellows who come from behavioral economics. Now, the traditional economics assumed the rational decision making, but the behavioral economics actually demonstrate that this element of decision making, right, in most times and quite often is shaped by cognitive biases and heuristics, by the way, and also emotions. So in other words, here you do not just move around and say, well, you know, we are adding a variable that is missing, that, you know, we are doing this and that. No, you don't massage, right, the ideas, but you simply dismiss these ideas, right? So again, if you look at the human development theory, right, the human development theory, the developers actually challenged the assumption that economic growth alone constitutes development, right? So that's why they come up with the alternative frameworks that actually emphasize a number of other things like capabilities, freedoms, right? Right. I am sure you know where those things are coming from. For some of you have read the capability theory, right? Some of you have interrogated the words of Naz Boomer, right, and others. You know exactly what we are talking about here, right? So, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, it's always very important for us to know where we are operating, right? And these are important areas, right? So you can see the true power of the work that Golden-Biddle and Locke actually constructed and their framework. And that power lies in the integration of construction and problematization, and that researchers must first actually construct the field through synthesized coherence that we have already seen, through progressive coherence and through non-coherence, right? And then from there, we problematize the field through incompleteness, through inadequacy and incommensurate, ladies and gentlemen. So as you can see, construction establishes the intellectual landscape, right? And that's why we are constructing knowledge within that area by establishing that intellectual landscape. But problematization establishes the need for research so that we are able to justify. So when you hear people asking you questions, ladies and gentlemen, that was this study really important, right? Did we have to undertake it? So those are the issues that they are actually thinking about, right, ladies and gentlemen. So allow me to stop here because I can see we've reached the top of the hour. And if you have questions, comments, ladies and gentlemen, I'll give you an opportunity to ask. And then I'll try to respond to those particular questions that you might be having, right? And I will attempt to answer the ones which I can answer. And any question that I am unable to answer, I'll not really answer it. But that's where we are. And I think in our next meeting, which is tomorrow, I'll start with the developing, right, a statement of the problem, right, using the knowledge that we have generated throughout these lectures. And then after after that, then we shall engage into another area. Right, so I can see some hands that have been raised, and I'll also look at the chat room to see whether there are some questions that we need to answer. Yes, please. I'll first take the one that that you are going to ask, Alex Otut, and then I'll go to the chat room. Alex, please go ahead.
Good morning, Professor. Thank you very much for. Yes, I'm getting you, Professor.
I'm hearing.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this elaborate presentation. It has enhanced my capacity.
I've lost you. I don't know whether it is you or my network.
In the literature review and problem is an observation.
I didn't.
And the presentation you have made on it.
I didn't hear what you
come
did.
again.
I didn't hear. Maybe my network or your network. Can you repeat?
Yes, I'm just starting. What I was saying is one is an observation. Am I clear?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, the first observation you have presented is on incommensurate problematization. Sometimes back, there was a product in the market called Ribena, where the suppliers claim it was rich in vitamin C.
I've lost you.
And a team from Makerere didn't have any drop or any trace of vitamin. Am I clear, Professor?
Your internet keeps dropping, but I think we can get the idea. How I wish you could summarize that there was a claim that Ribena was rich in vitamin.
Yeah, it was a claim. Yeah, it was a claim that the product contained vitamin C, yet it didn't. But now the question I have is on another thing about synthesized coherence. These days, people emphasize so much about relevant literature. There may be different material which is not really very close to your study, but it gives you some additional information which is relevant. How do we balance this on issues of relevant literature and synthesized coherence? Thank you.
Okay. I understand where you are coming from, right? So you started by talking about incommensurate, and then later on you move to synthesized literature, right? As I said, these views will always exist in the various disciplines, right? Your doctoral committee might say you're coming from agribusiness, for example, and they say that we only want you to come from agriculture. Don't pick anything from elsewhere, right? Now, if your committee tells you that, please do, right, what they have asked you. After all, there are ways of constructing, many other ways of constructing literature, right? Not necessarily the one that you wanted to take. But later on, after getting your PhD, you can challenge them because you are all going to be competing for space in the international scholarly area. And your work will be reviewed by many scholars, right? So you pick literature, right, in those particular area, right? Because now what you are going to come up with under synthesized literature is not just a summary of many studies, but the researchers' organized integration of what the field says, where the arguments converge, where they converge, and what assumptions hold the field together. So in other words, relevant literature here will mean, right, to the specific body of work that directly speaks to the phenomenon or directly speaks to the theory or constructs or context and research problem. Now, in problematization, the researcher does not review everything. The researcher carefully selects the literature whose assumptions need to be questioned. So a good doctoral student should not merely ask what has not been studied. Instead, the student should ask what dominant assumptions in the relevant literature has shaped how scholars understand this phenomenon and what happens if that assumption is no longer valid. So that is where the synthesized literature review becomes a serious intellectual exercise. It moves from reporting, right, the studies that you have come across to interrogating the logic of the field. But if the area is very new, by the way, my friend Otut, if the area is very new and people are picking frameworks, right, from all over the place, then you will be allowed to do so. I think last time when we had a lecture at Makerere, I gave you an example of homeostasis, right? A concept that largely comes from medicine, right? But now it has found its way into what we call organizational studies, even entrepreneurship and other areas. Sociology, right, has also embraced the concept and so forth. So in other words, if you are able to demonstrate the need for further investigation by bringing the common concepts, right, methodologies and so forth, you capitalize on the agreements, right, in that part, and therefore you establish the need for further investigation because you'll be able to tell your friends that the next logical step in the growing understanding of this field is actually this, right? Because that is very, very important. So it is true, you can use the progressive coherence by emphasizing cumulative knowledge growth, by bringing the consensus of perspectives and methods, and that will be it, right? Because you are demonstrating that. Now for synthesized coherence, you are bringing the unrelated work, right? From botany, from where, as long as you are able to highlight points of agreement, right? In order for you to demonstrate the need for further investigation. If you're able to do that, then that's okay. So what are those concepts that are commonly accepted? What are those methodologies? What are those perspectives? The moment you do it very well, there's no problem. I think, sometimes we ask these questions assuming that all our studies conform, right, to these ways of constructing knowledge, when in the actual sense they don't. So if they ask you to balance, then if you are using synthesized coherence and it doesn't make sense, now that you find the area is mature, there's a lot of literature. So that means you can no longer convince the scholars that you need synthesized coherence. So you go for progressive coherence. So you start by reviewing literature, right, whereby you document cumulative knowledge, consensus of perspectives, methods, and then you say, well, this area has a well-developed and focused line of inquiry, but, right, this is where we should be moving now. That will be okay. Have I answered your question, sir? Well, I'm confused.
Yes, Professor.
All right.
I'm okay.
Okay. Let's see the other questions that exist. I think in the chat room, I've seen Kimanga is greeting. But as we challenge dominant research, we would be attacking many scholars. I think that is very normal. This one here, Ivan, how can I problematize this? When people are excluded from payroll. Right. Right. Ivan's question. I think you can see it there. Ivan. Right. When people are excluded from payroll through retirement, they keep struggling with financial inclusion, where the person was a finance expert like PS, ministry auditor general. Right. By the way, not all people who retire actually are excluded from the payroll. Some organizations have policies that they receive half pay. I think the AMA is, it may not be half pay, but a certain percentage. Bank of Uganda, I think, is one of them. I think the AMA is another one. You have other institutions, right, as well, who have those. Right. So, Ivan, my simple answer is that retired individuals who experience financial experience, this is a very nice area for you to problematize, right? Ivan, the conventional assumption underlying much of the financial inclusion literature is that financial knowledge, right, and expertise and literacy automatically lead to financial inclusion and financial well-being. Yet the phenomenon that you describe, right, appears to contradict this assumption, where the former permanent secretaries or accountants general or auditor general, finance professionals and professors often possess extensive financial knowledge, but still struggle financially after retirement. Now, this raises several potentially problematizing questions, Ivan, that you can start thinking about. One, is financial literacy truly sufficient for financial inclusion after retirement? That's question number one. Financial literacy, is it truly sufficient? And can we continue mounting those programs? Number two, does employment status matter more than financial knowledge? Then the third question you can begin asking yourself, are existing financial inclusion models overly focused on individual capability while neglecting institutional and structural barriers? The other question you should ask yourself is, does payroll attachment create a hidden dependency that scholars have overlooked? The other issue is, are retirement transitions exposing weaknesses in current theories of financial inclusion? And to me, if you ask such questions, right, you'll be able to move beyond identifying a gap and begin challenging underlying assumptions in the literature. The other thing that you have to think about, right, is, I mean, once you've asked yourself these particular questions, right, Ivan, then you review the literature, right, that exists and the theories that exist and see where, right, most of these things have gone wrong. And those are the ones we are going to attack, right, at that level. So to me, I think that is where you should go. So that was Ivan. Sitali only 9 words on the slide, but Rich, okay. Literature review is sophisticated. Then Sitali is not a passive consumption, okay. Ronnie, some colleagues hide their work. Robert Kanusu, I'm so happy that, hey, happy to Doctorus, Geoffrey Muhumuza for introducing me to this very important, okay. Sitali, you never go wrong. Ronnie, looking at any work during each lecture, and I keep making points, okay. I think most of the issues in the chat room, right, have been addressed. Let me see. Are there others? Okay, there is another one here that someone has just posted. I hadn't actually seen it. Right. And the people who have contributed here are Kwikiriza. Right. How can I, Kwikiriza, how can I problematize this? And accompanied refugee minors who are excluded from from participation in matters that concerns them, whose agency has been ignored, etc. Right. Wilson, when I look at your problem, sorry, your challenge there, I see that this is a very promising area, right, for problematization, because it contains several assumptions that appear to have been taken for granted in much of the refugee and humanitarian literature, right? And you'll discover that much of, and I saw this when we are undertaking our project that ran for 3 years, and it closed around 2025, right? In the humanitarian setting, and it was in the refugee area, and that was DIG CBA, right? Yeah, it's true that traditionally many humanitarian interventions, of course, which involve unaccompanied refugee minors, have been built upon the implicit assumption that children are primarily the vulnerable dependents, right, requiring protection and care. In fact, when we went to some of those centers, we discovered that some of these fellows were actually heads of some households. I mean, what you call minors. By the way, even within the country, right, those things exist. So you find that the adult, right, passes on, and the children take on that responsibility. So consequently, the policies and programs often position them as passive beneficiaries of decisions that are made by adults, and of course they are passive because adults make those decisions, humanitarian agencies make those decisions, governments make decisions, and of course social workers, right? So a problematizing scholar like yourself would ask whether this assumption is justified. So one could begin by questioning the dominant assumption that vulnerability necessarily implies incapacity, right? And of course here, while an unaccompanied refugee minor, or minors in this case, face significant vulnerabilities, does vulnerability automatically mean they lack agency? Does it mean that they actually lack decision making? Does it mean that they actually lack capacity? Does it mean that they actually lack experience, knowledge, right? Or meaningful contributions to the design of interventions affecting their lives? So to me, the literature may reveal a tension between two competing perspectives. On one hand, protection-oriented approaches emphasizing safeguarding children from harm. And on the other hand, you'll find the rights-based approaches, particularly those that are informed by the principle of the United Nations Children Fund and the United Nations, right, emphasizing the fact that children participation in decisions affecting them is probably critical in this case. So this will create an opportunity for problematization, right? And the researcher, if it is yourself, sir, will argue that existing scholarship and practice have disproportionately privilege the protection narratives while underestimating children's agency. As a result, interventions may inadvertently silence the very individuals they are intended to support. So there are many questions that you come up with. These questions might be one, why are unaccompanied refugee minors, why are they simultaneously recognized as right holders, yet often excluded from decision-making processes affecting their welfare? And that's a credible question. The other credible question would be, does the humanitarian sector overemphasize vulnerability at the expense of agency? The other question that you might actually raise is, to what extent do current participation frameworks genuinely incorporate children voices rather than merely consulting them symbolically? Right, plus a number of other things there, right? So to me, I see the theoretical contribution could therefore arise not from identifying a simple gap in the literature, but from challenging the underlying assumptions that protection and participation are mutually exclusive, right? And you come up with your own argument. So once you do that, you'll be able to move your study from a conventional lack of participation narrative towards a deeper scholarly problem concerning how humanitarian systems conceptualize childhood, how they conceptualize vulnerability, how they conceptualize agency, and how they conceptualize voice. Right. So to me, I think that is where you should be going if that is your problem. So ladies and gentlemen, allow me to stop here. I can see that many people are signing out. I don't know. Martha, is it very urgent? And James Chiwanuka? Okay, we can take Martha's and then James Chiwanuka and stop. Martha?
Thank you, Professor Ntayi, for this insightful lecture this morning. I was just wondering now that we have all this knowledge and we have now AI, we have people coming up with models, some of them very basic, like the ICA model, which only looks at, is it 3 things? I think there is only the ideal situation, reality, and consequences. Now, how do you marry all this in problematizing your research? You know, it's becoming really confusing, like which one should I take? Which one is ideal for doctoral level? Thank you, Prof.
All right, Martha, AI, right? Now we have so many things like knowledge, right? Like what I've given you, what AI and other models that you were given, right? Where you start from ideal, right? Moving down, you have come up with the models, right? Of how to present the statement of the problem, right? For me, my response to your question is that please stick to the university regulations and structures that have been given to you. If you are told to use the ideal model and moving downwards to all of those things that constitute a problem, please go ahead, because what you need is a PhD anyway at this material time. But after finishing your PhD, challenge, right, those things that are taken for granted. And after all, you'll be at the same level. Number 2, we have artificial intelligence, right? To me, I've always said that artificial intelligence has come and has come to stay, and there's nothing wrong with it, right? To me, what you have mentioned as AI and knowledge, and those models, including the theoretical models, they do provide a rich foundation for problematization, because they often contain assumptions that researchers accept without actually questioning, right? So a problematizing researcher does not simply apply a model, rather the researcher interrogates the assumptions, the boundaries, the applicability, and the consequences of the model. Now, if we go to AI and problematization, I can tell you that the rapid growth of artificial intelligence has generated numerous assumptions that can be challenged, right? For example, AI improves decision quality is an assumption. AI is objective and unbiased. AI enhances organizational performance, right? I read the information available on the internet recently, and I listened. And the Standard Chartered Bank, I think in the UK, has decided to go AI, right? And they're going to lay off a number of employees and retool some. So the whole processes of providing services, Standard Chartered Bank UK will be using AI, right? So there are so many assumptions. AI can replace human judgment. AI generated knowledge is reliable. A problematizing student or scholar would ask, right, under what conditions does AI actually improve decision quality? Can AI ever be truly objective if it learns from historically biased data? Because this is using large language models, and what it gives you will depend on the data it has been fed on. So can you say AI is objective, truly objective, if it is learning from historically biased data that has been published by us? And does greater reliance on artificial intelligence reduce critical human thinking? Is that correct? Right? Are organizations becoming more efficient or merely more dependent on technology? Right? All those things are issues that you need to think about, right? So in other words, you have what we call the interpretive assumptions. I may not go into details of those things now, right? And of course, what we call the role of AI in problematizing. And if you're going to use AI, you need to be very careful. In fact, maybe we shall have a day when we'll be talking about responsible, right, and the ethical use of artificial intelligence. I think what is missing here is the responsible and ethical use of AI. AI is there, right? AI should never become a pilot. You are the pilot. AI is a co-pilot, right? You can use it. You've seen how AI has transformed the military field when it comes to fighting. You don't have to train 1 million soldiers and deploy them in the field. In fact, AI can kill them within a second, right? But if your soldiers go to the field, they are 1 million, and all of them are equipped with the AI, right? So forth, tools and techniques and gadgets and so forth. The job they will do in the field is fantastic. They can destroy the enemy. But remember that people are coming up with more advanced technology. In fact, AI, those gadgets that have been developed using AI can miss targets, right? You've seen how there have been missing targets in the, I mean, where we have had these fights between America and our friends there, right, in the Middle East, right? So you know what has been happening, right? Now, if AI was accurate 100%, I can assure you that those fellows would have been finished within a very short time, right? But you see, even that very area, the Homs, right, Strait of Homs has become a challenge, right? The Americans, even when they deploy so many soldiers there, it is not as easy as they think, right? The same happened in Somalia. Excuse me. So Do not, AI has come, but it's a co-pilot, not a pilot. Another question? James Chiwanuka, you'll be the last one.
Thank you very much, Professor. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me, Prof?
Please, James Scott, we are hearing you.
Go ahead, go ahead, go ahead.
Hello, Prof. Can you hear me?
Yes, we are hearing you. Go ahead.
Hello?
Wanuka, we can hear you.
Okay, so Professor, thank you very much for this presentation this morning. My issue is about problematization. I have a topic I'm trying to do around a particular disease condition. This disease condition starts early in childhood, and it impacts the adolescent stage and the young adulthood stage. However, there is a great variation in the risk factors, especially among children and adolescents. And there are no universally agreed guidelines for screening this disease condition. Prof, kindly help me on how I can go about problematizing this information. Thank you.
Yes, Chiwanuka, I think the story you have told us is incomplete. Right, and giving you an answer becomes a little bit problematic, right? Because just telling us that your topic is around the physical conditions and that you are dealing with the adults, right? And that you don't have a screening mechanism is not sufficient, right? So for me, I think.
Can I make it more clear, Prof?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Yes, I'm dealing with a condition called hip osteonecrosis among people living with sickle cell disease. Now, that condition starts early in childhood. However, some children are often asymptomatic, and it's very difficult to screen them around that age. But if you leave it unscreened, the head of the femur collapses and they get pain and limping almost throughout their lives until an intervention is done. So my concern is around the fact that we don't have universally agreed guidelines to screen it in childhood. And so I'm having a little bit of a challenge on how I can problematize that.
So your problem is problematizing, right? Not so?
Yes, Prof.
Okay. Now, of course, I should also let you know that I'm not an expert in that area. And that is, I'll give you what I think from what you have just said, right? So this, to me, this is a nice area where you do not, where scholars do not seem to agree, or even practitioners, I think. So, and you're saying there is no universally agreed, right, upon guidelines. So to me, my advice is that when a health condition is sufficiently important, right, usually evidence accumulates. and when that evidence accumulates, it eventually leads to standardized screening guidelines, right? Yet in your case, when you are dealing with the sickle cell disease, right, and sickle cell is actually well known, the adolescents with the sickle cell disease, they are actually recognized as a vulnerable population. And I'm sure that's what you are saying, not so? Hello?
Yes, Prof.
Yeah. And meaning that the physical complications can have serious long-term consequences, right? And of course, the screening is widely regarded as important. So despite these things that you have mentioned, there are no universally agreed screening guidelines for children and adolescents. Is that correct?
Yes, Prof.
So meaning that there is an anomaly, right? So instead of asking why there are no guidelines, ask why has decades of clinical experience and research on sickle cell disease failed to produce universally accepted screening guidance for adolescents? And to me, this is a much stronger scholarly question that you can actually problematize later on, right? And I think if you start by challenging existing assumptions, I think you need to look at the assumptions that exist, right? And then try to challenge them, right? For example, you may discover that the first assumption you have is that more evidence, right, naturally leads to some bit of consensus. And by the way, I've seen that in the area of public health and in your areas, you do lots of systematic literature reviews. Have you done one yet?
I've attempted one, Prof, and I've gathered a lot of information which does not come to a conclusion in terms of us accepted guidelines.
Oh, fantastic. So, to me, I think if you have done one systematic literature review, attempt to publish it, right? I hope you've done it very well, and your protocol, of course, your Prisma has been registered because you need to register it first, right? And then to have your work published. So do that. If you can have a paper published in that area, based on systematic literature review, then that will be okay. You can use it as a springboard for your work, right? Then, of course, there are other assumptions that I do not know, right, that you can challenge. Then after that, to me, I think you'd move to a third area, right, where you look at universal guidelines, right? Do you have universal guidelines? So there is an assumption on universal guidelines. So the problematization right here is that the absence of universal guidelines, right, of insufficient knowledge. Is that what you are assuming, by the way? That there is absence of universal guidelines, evidence of insufficient knowledge? Or in your case, you are looking at substantial clinical, biological, and contextual variations among adolescents living with the sickle cell diseases. Is your focus on the absence of universal guidance evidence?
Prof, I think the issue is about the context of the adolescents and children, whereby it causes a variation in the risk factors across the board.
Okay. Are there contradictions?
Yes, Prof, they are.
From your review of literature?
Yes, there are contradictions. For example, if you look at... Hello?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, I was saying that, for example, there are some risk factors that were earlier mentioned in the previous studies, that is between 1990s and early 2000, which have been challenged, and they are found actually not to be risk factors for the condition. For example, the emergence of hydroxyurea initially was thought to be a high risk factor for osteonecrosis of the femoral head. However, the recent studies have actually found that hydroxyurea doesn't have any effect on the occurrence of the complication. But instead, when a person is on the drug, they don't develop new lesions and the old lesions don't progress. And then other studies have found that if a person is on the drug, the risk actually is very low. So that contradiction is also there.
Okay, fine. And that's the only contradiction, or there are many others? Do you think if you center your study around contradictions, you can get a better problematized statement? I think so. Right, where the literature generally assumes this and the other, right? And yet, despite decades of research and clinical experience in sickle cell disease, you find that you do not have universal accepted guidelines. And of course, the situation particularly becoming puzzling because of A, B, C, and D. And you go into the persistence of divergent screening practices, raising important questions regarding the things that you want to talk about. To me, I think since you have contradictions, you can center your problem around contradictions. So what do you want to do at the end of the, what do you want to come up with at the end of the day in your study? To me, I think this can be done if you center around contradictions. But since I haven't read your work, I may not know exactly what you are focusing on, right? And in me not being an expert in the area, I can only help you to problematize if you give me the facts, right, about the contradictions and the direction you want to take. But as to whether that's what you should be studying, then that's a question that must be answered by you critically engaging with the literature and seeing whether you want to undertake a study in an area that is largely contested, right, where you have disputes and debates existing and contradicting evidences. Right, so that's what I can say at the moment. But my friend Chiwanuka, if we ever get an opportunity to meet and you explain and I understand and you and then so that I pick the ideas, not in a class setting like this, maybe we can put our heads together and see what can be developed in terms of problematization. Right, thank you very much. So ladies and gentlemen, I think let's stop at this point since we are going to have a lecture tomorrow in the evening. So ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for attending this session and for being so patient. I can see we started at 9, now it is 12, 3 hours. So enjoy your Saturday, enjoy your weekend, and bye for now.
Thanks, Professor. Have a good weekend.
Have a beautiful day.